Hey everyone, welcome to a fake episode of the Arena Decklist podcast. I guess since we're focusing on YouTube content a little bit more, maybe this is the real episode?
You can't mess with the original, right?
No, of course not.
Certainly we will never replace the Arena Decklist podcast. We're just supplementing it, and we wanted to do so in a timely fashion. And we also wanted to give something to our new YouTube subscribers, of which there are many, by the way. People responded to the call for YouTube subscribers. So props to everyone who's watching this right now. You can do the whole like, share, subscribe thing. That is awesome for us if you want to help spread the Arena Decklist word. And we will repay you with content like this.
Yeah, so do another call, basically, is what we're implying.
Yeah.
You know, it's implied. Like, share, subscribe, always. Every time, even if we don't say it. But yeah, I'm Jerry Thompson. Here with me, as always, is Brian Gottlieb. And we're going to break down the Fandom Legends top 8 deck lists, of which you participated in. You won the tournament.
I did.
I was not playing. Otherwise, I probably would have won, let's be honest. But I'm not cool. I wasn't invited.
I think you would have played a bad deck.
Whoa.
And
never.
Unlike you, I played the best deck in Standard, as I've been told by several people. I mean, it's not my call to make. This is other people's words saying this might be the best deck in Standard.
Yeah, Esper Stacks.
No, not Esper Stacks. This is a horrible name for this deck, by the way. If you're calling this deck Esper Stacks right now, please stop. The simple name is Esper Dance. I will also expect Mansell Make 'em Dance, but definitely not Esper Stacks.
Esper Dance it is, yeah. So you won the tournament pretty easily. From what I could tell, I watched like half, maybe most of the tournament, and you basically just smashed people. And maybe it's a combination of it being like week 0 Standard effectively, but I don't know. I don't really think so. I think you kind of nailed it for this tournament.
Well, so I think there's a few points about my deck that made it a very strong decision. The first one to come to mind is just Teferi. Teferi's still insane, and like the entire previous format was built around the restriction of Teferi. This new format may be less so in the early days. We'll see. But more importantly, it was about Kaya's Wrath. And you and I talked over on the podcast about how when I watched the streamer showcase, I had 15 games in front of me. I'm watching them all, and all I see is battlefield after battlefield loaded up with creatures.
All creatures.
Just staring at each other.
Questing beasts as far as the eye could see.
Right, and that brings you to the place where you're like, I want to play a Kaya's Wrath deck. And certainly I'm very comfortable doing that. I've played a ton of Esper over the past year and a half or so, whenever Kaya's Wrath came out. But the problem is the mana's really bad in Standard, and that's why I was pretty excited when I saw this deck from Andrew Cuneo, and then brought a little bit more to light by Andre Strosky, and then refined a little bit by me, and maybe refined in some instances, made worse in others, who knows. But an actual playable Kaya's Wrath deck, and the addition of Golden Egg and Guild Globe to fix your mana. Obviously, that's not their headline job, but they do that, and it does matter a lot for this deck.
Yeah. So Fable Passage is great. It is very good at fixing your mana. It does enable these 3-color mana bases. Sometimes it's a little painful with, anywhere from 10 to 12 shocklands, but it's doable. It's workable. And before Fable Passage, we didn't think that we were actually going to get to a spot where that would happen in Standard. And for it to be a basic land fetch in any instance where you have to get basic island, that effectively shuts off your Kaya's Wrath, because you need this card as early as possible against the creature decks. Like, the creatures are very powerful, very hard-hitting. You can't really afford to delay this by a turn. So, yeah, the eggs just end up incidentally fixing your mana in a way that is completely necessary, and there's not really a home for Kaya's Wrath otherwise, because you need Fable Passage in the mana base to enable playing that third color, and Orzhov by itself doesn't really have a shell of a deck.
I started thinking about that. I'm like, is there an Orzhov deck where I can just play Kaya's Wrath and just a ton of black-white lands? I don't think there is. I think this is a much better approach. I talked a lot more about this deck in a Esper Dance specific deck tech that's going to go up on the YouTube page. I don't know which one will go up first, but at some point you'll be able to see a Esper Dance specific deck tech, and I go into everything on a card-by-card basis, so I'm not going to rehash that here. The real takeaways, Doom Foretold is absolutely insane, like just a bonkers Magic card. Don't forget about that non-token clause, please, as you heard Jerry do on this week's podcast, and I think a lot of us did when we first read this card.
Yeah, I read it. My brain didn't really process it, because it's such a weird clause, especially on something like this. And in the last couple of days, playing games on Arena, both with and against this card, it has come up where I play like, something into an Oko and they play a Doom Foretold, and I'm just like, idiot, I'm just going to sack my food, and then my turn rolls around, and it's like, oh yeah, damn it. I keep just forgetting.
Got him.
We have to get used to that, especially if you anticipate playing in live tournaments with, either with a deck like this or, this deck is going to be popular. Like, it will see play. You will play against this card. This mistake is going to happen. People are going to just sack foods to it or, 1/1 tokens or whatever. And that's just going to be a thing that happens in Standard for at least the next few months. And another interesting thing that came up with this card was when my Wilderness Reclamation opponent played a Tamiyo. And my first thought was, I play this card and they just can't sacrifice anything, and then it just sort of like locks me under it. So why would I ever cast it? And I just like held it for a few turns when I didn't have anything else to really do with my mana, and then I ended up just like playing it later. And the wording on the card makes it so if they can't sacrifice anything, then you bust the Doom Foretold.
And Tamiyo makes it impossible to sacrifice anything.
So I thought that it would just sit around eating my permanents, eventually eat itself, and that's not what happened. I could have just cycled it for a card and a 2/2, and that 2/2 would have, been pressuring the Tamiyo, maybe dealing my opponent damage. And yeah, it's just like another weird quirk of the card, another weird interaction. So get used to it. Because even outside of like the weird quirks, like this card is for real. It's very good.
Very, very good card. I would have never known this Tamiyo interaction had you not told me about it. It's a little unintuitive, and I think this card in general is unintuitive to play around. The Fandom Legends tournament is comprised of just some of the best Magic players on the planet, and me for some reason. And people misplayed against this card all day long. And I'm not bringing this up to like drag anyone. It's just, it was day 0 Standard. This is a weird and complicated card, and you can totally understand why folks aren't used to it yet. But I think Shahar, like Assassin's Trophy, the Doom Foretold with the trigger on the stack, and no permanents in play, trying to deny me access to the card and the 2/2.
But you still got it.
Still got it. Triggers on the stack.
Yeah, the trigger still goes off.
Right. Brad Nelson turned a forest into a creature with his Oko, and then the forest had to be sacrificed to the Doom Foretold because it becomes an elk and loses its land type.
You need to Nissa it first, right?
Nissa first, yes.
Yeah, Nissa first, and then you elk
Correct.
it. Elk makes it lose the land type, and now it's a thing that's able to get edicted by Doom Foretold. So that was another thing I wanted to bring up.
We both were dumbfounded. I had no idea what happened.
Yeah, you're just like, what?
Yep.
Where does land go? What? You probably thought you were just getting crushed, right?
Yeah, it was completely unexpected. This is a weird Magic card, but it's a powerful one. I really loved my time playing with this deck. I messed a few things up in deck building. Cut the Wishclaw Talisman. It's no good. Play a 4th Doom Foretold. It's the best card in your deck. Get rid of the Disenchants in the sideboard. They do nothing. Play D-Sparks instead. But then you have a pretty week 1 ready deck on your hands.
Yeah, I mean, you have to make some concessions to the mirror match now. And also you have to be aware of the fact that this is a known quantity. It's not like, someone just like tweeted out a deck list or whatever. You also won a tournament with it.
Sure.
And it's an interesting deck. So people are going to be ready for it. They're going to have their reps in against it. People might actually be playing it themselves, and then you'll encounter mirror matches, and mirror matches will be ready for you. So things like Unmoored Ego, I think you could safely expect to tick up, especially since people just love that card in general, that sort of effect. So you're going to need some alternate win condition in your sideboard probably to pivot.
Oh, we found it already. Don't worry about it, Gerald. Do you want to tell them what it is?
No. Like you gotta keep them hooked. I think we're going to do this one first and then the deck tech. I think that makes sense.
Oh, look at you doing a little salesmanship.
Yo, dude, this is my job. I literally do this for a living.
Go watch that deck tech.
Yeah, find out Brian's win condition of choice. I think it's nonsense, but we'll see.
Jerry thought this deck was nonsense, by the way.
I still think it's nonsense. I played 2 matches with it. It was the worst 2 hours of my life.
Great. I'm glad I could take those 2 hours away from you. I'll tell you, the 6 hours I spent playing with it in Fandom were an absolute joy. I loved every second of it.
Okay. So yeah, you won. You defeated in the finals former world champion, the fervent champion himself, Javier Dominguez.
You have to imagine the temptation to play that card in week 1 was strong. It's a good card.
I assumed he was going to.
Right.
It is. Yeah, it's a decent card. I mean, you have homes like either Rakdos Knights, Mardu Knights, something along those lines, but also just like mono red and
Cavalcade.
Javier has definitely played some red decks. You know, he is good with them, but they're not that great right now.
No, they're not. And I spoke with Autumn a little bit after they finished their end of the tournament. Not entirely pleased with the red deck that they registered. Thinks there's still some more room to work on that archetype. I like the Cavalcade lists, but I could even see them having problems when there's a 6 rat deck walking around. They don't do well against rats. They have to find a really fast hand. So, but anyway, back to Javier's deck. These Simic-based decks, I think if I didn't win the tournament, they're the slam dunk story of the tournament, right?
Yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised that they're not getting more press because there were, 7 Simic-based decks in the tournament,
Correct.
in the field. Granted, the field is 16 players. 3-2 is typically a lock for top 8 in these things. And, you know, you might think like, oh, if you 3-2 in the top 8, you lose, your record's 3-3. That's not very good. But again, these tournaments are stacked. So like a 50% win percentage in a field this good is maybe like a 60 to 65% win rate on Arena or something like that. You know, like a top 8 loss in this tournament, I think, is still very indicative of like a good performance and a good deck. And in this case, 5 of the 7 Simic decks made the elimination rounds. Javier, I think, worked with Marcio, right? Like they played the same deck, basically.
Card for card, same deck, yeah.
Okay.
And then they played each other in the top 8.
Oh, all right. So yeah, obviously someone's getting knocked out there. So maybe had they been in opposite sides of the bracket, like maybe you could have like 1-2 punch knocked him out or whatever. But like
I played both in the Swiss. I beat Javier in the Swiss. I lost to Marcio. I thought the matchup was close, although in my finals match against Javier, he kind of just got blown up. I don't think his draws were great whatsoever, and mine were particularly strong. But I do think the matchup is like, if anything, I think it was in their favor, and I just drew better than they did. But maybe I'm being a little bit diminutive of my own chances. I think Brad said he thought I was pretty far favored in the matchup, and his list is similar to Javier's minus Teferi. So I don't know. Time will tell exactly who's got the edge.
Yeah, and I mean, especially both of these decks are now going to adapt, right? Like now we know that Simic-based decks, at least, are going to be a wide portion of the format. I know that I watched Show stream your deck a little bit. I knew it was your deck because he still had the 2 disenchants in his sideboard.
Don't play those.
Doesn't follow you on Twitter, I guess?
I guess not. I think he does, actually.
Yeah, maybe. I mean,
I think he does.
Yeah, he strikes me as the type of dude who likes building his own stuff, right? You know, so like he's
does a great job of it.
Yeah, of course. I definitely agree with that, but like he's probably not, you know, crawling Twitter for like the latest bits of technology or whatever.
Makes sense, yeah.
He learns this stuff and iterates on his decks as he streams, which makes it pretty interesting, you know. But he was definitely lamenting the lack of Noxious Grasp, and he's just like, Noxious Grasp is so good. It's like the best card. Why don't you have any? And I think both of us expected a little bit more of the big artifacts.
Right.
And maybe expected things like these Bant decks to not be as prevalent, at least in week 1. But now we have 5 Simic decks in the top 8 out of the 7 in the field. They all are different enough, but have a lot of similarities also. And especially, you know, Javier and Marcio's list, 12 Planeswalkers, Oko, Teferi, Nissa, all of them very hard to deal with. I would probably recommend that Esper going forward does play some copies of Noxious Grasp to help address matchups like this.
Sure.
So, you know, things are going to change on both sides. But yeah, I definitely agree that in general, like the lower to the ground, kind of tempo-y deck with a lot of disruption, a lot of powerful threats, a lot of card advantage, like they're going to beat up your combo control deck a decent amount of the time.
I also benefited a ton from knowing my opponent's exact list, knowing how many negates and mystical disputes they could possibly have access to, being able to play through those very well. So it was one of those things where I think the Esper Dance deck was particularly well suited for an open deckless field, which is weird. It's hard to identify which decks that's going to be true of, but it was definitely true in this case. Just looking at this deck, though, man, the power level of these cards, kind of off the charts, right? Like Oko, Teferi, Nissa, 4 Hydroid Krasis. You have the only 1 mana Accelerant in Standard. And the card that really blew my mind throughout the day that I think looks so impressive.
Wicked Wolf?
Wicked Wolf. Yeah. It was so good. And there's going to be so many copies as we move through these decks in the top 8. Brad Nelson and PV both playing it. We'll talk more about it, I'm sure. But that card is a house, just an absolute house.
Yeah, it's so good. And you might look at this deck and be like, oh, there's not a lot of food producers. But Oko just keeps that chain rolling, and Oko is also just very, very hard to kill. So if they draw one, they're probably going to have a solid supply of food for the rest of the game, most likely.
I think that's true, and don't sleep on the goose either.
No, I know.
Into the goose and make food that way.
I was going to say, like, this deck clearly is capable of generating a lot of mana. You know, you have a lot of mana dorks, Leafkin Druid, Gilded Goose, also a random Paradise Druid hanging out there. Your homie, Arboreal Grazer, taking up a slot. Also, you can clearly tell that they're prepared for that with, like, Hydroid Krasis and 2 Voracious Hydras. So yeah, this deck is going to have a lot of mana. It's not going to be uncommon for you to have turns where you play a spell or two and still have the goose left over to make a food. So not a ton of total enablers, but like, you know, even with decks like this, right? Like there's not a lot of removal, and Esper, I think, capitalized on that. These decks building, you know, just a deck with like 20 to 30 creatures, and you just punish them for that. But I think most of the decks in the format are gonna, like a lot of them are gonna look like this, where like the goose is just gonna be there in play for the entirety of the game, and obviously that's gonna make a lot of food too.
It's very easy to see why this was a tough tournament for Mono Red with all these Wicked Wolves around, right? What a miserable card to play against as Mono Red. And if you ever stabilize, you move the game out of reach so quickly with all this food floating around the battlefield. Mono Red's going to have to adapt for sure if it's going to make inroads into the format.
Yeah, the deck is not as good as it once was.
Right.
Goblin Chain Whirler being gone means that things like Paradise Druid are safe, and granted, Javier and Marcio don't have a ton of them in their list because they're playing Leafkin Druid because it's a druid or a elemental for Risen Reef.
Right.
You know, so yeah, these decks are free to just do things like that, not get punished, and just the overall card quality of the mono red deck has gone down significantly. And they still have Frenzy, but they don't have all the great burn spells. A lot of the current builds don't really incentivize you to play Runaway Steamkin either. So like your Frenzies are kind of neutered in that degree too. So yeah, just mono red got a lot worse. Bant got a lot better as a result, and Bant didn't really lose anything in rotation either. Nope. And the mana base is completely fine. They weren't super interested in temples to begin with, so Fabled Passage is just like a nice pickup period for the deck.
Yeah.
And you get to play this deck where you're just like mana, some ramping, some card advantage, some planeswalkers, and then you also get to play things like Wicked Wolf and Voracious Hydra, which are removal tacked onto like these already good creatures, so you don't necessarily end up with a bunch of dead cards against a control deck. So these decks basically just have it all.
This is a great week one deck.
Absolutely.
It's so streamlined, so obviously powerful. Just game against absolutely everyone. Fantastic choice from Javier and Marcio.
And they have great sideboard options too.
Agreed, yeah. And so what do you think about Mystical Dispute? I've played against this card a lot now as the blue deck that you assume this card is supposed to target. And it was kind of a joke against me. I found it very easy to play around.
Yeah, it's easy to play around, especially in your deck. Like, you have Thought Erasure, so either you can take it if you care, or you can just be cognizant of the fact that it exists, and they are forced to keep open 3 mana. I mean, depending on what they're trying to tag. Like,
right.
Doom Foretold is obviously a card that matters, and I think people were mostly playing Dispute to tag things like Teferi, and even like Kaya's Wrath is a card that matters, right? So yeah, if you're expecting a lot of Teferi and Oko and you think that Mystical Dispute is the card that you need to play to target those cards, then fine. I support that, but I don't think that it is a very strong card. And these decks are all set up to grind. The games go on long. There are things like Nissa that produce just a ton of mana, and Dispute goes dead very quickly. I would be looking at something more like Disdainful Stroke or Negate, even though Disdainful Stroke doesn't touch the 3 mana planeswalkers. Negate does, but that's not really what you want to be doing on the early turns. So like in a mirror match, for example, I would not want to board in Negate. I wouldn't even really want to board in Mystical Dispute, but like it's fine. It's slightly better. So yeah, I'm just not a fan of that card in general, unless there ends up being something specific that you're hard targeting.
We did this a lot in the last format, where you're incentivized to bring in Negate, Veil of Summer, Mystical Dispute against the Teferi decks.
And then once they have Teferi on the battlefield, all the cards don't matter.
And that happened to Javier in our finals match. I kept the Teferi on the battlefield for the vast majority of the game, and his hand at one point was like Mystical Dispute double Negate, and just can't do anything. And that was the problem I was continually running into in previous Standard, and it got to the point where I was just like, this counter magic is not a realistic option. And even Veil of Summer I got really low on at one point. I think it maybe has improved a little bit right now, but on the whole, Teferi messes up everything. And these cards would be almost oppressive, especially Veil of Summer, if not for Teferi. But in the absence, I don't know. I don't know if the numbers are supposed to be quite as high on the counter magic.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, obviously, Dance of the Manse is the card that you're the most scared about, but I think as long as you're not getting beat up by a bunch of Wraths and Noxious Grasp and stuff, like, even a good-sized Dance, bringing back, like, 4 things as 4/4s, like, the Bant deck can beat that so easily, you know? Like, the Dance is only going to kill you after they've already stabilized, so focus on doing things that allow you to beat their Kaya's Wraths.
Yeah, find ways to be proactive and protect yourself from Kaya's Wrath. I think that's the key. Get on the battlefield in the appropriate amounts. Like, some kind of flash threat would be absolutely absurd, which is a nice way to segue to the next deck, if you're ready.
Yep, I'm ready.
Why don't we pop over to Brad Nelson's deck? Brad played Simic. No white mana in this list, but a crucial addition from Javier's list. Obviously has a lot of the same hallmarks, except 3 copies of Brazen Borrower, which I think is a pretty cool card in this meta.
Also, 8 fights on his creatures, Wicked Wolf and Voracious Hydra, and even if your opponent doesn't have creatures, they're still reasonable threats.
Sure.
Like, we just talk about how Kaya's Wrath is the most important thing. Well, if you have, like, food into Wicked Wolf, you're in a tight spot. And you, like, a lot of your removal just doesn't even touch it, right? Like Oath of Kaya, whatever. You just can't really do anything against that card, and then Brazen Borrower also makes things way more awkward for you. And I think if in the game you're talking about against Javier, had access to something like Brazen Borrower, it's not that difficult to just like bounce your Teferi, have Negate open, and just put you in a tough spot that way. So I think that card is just a thing that was overlooked in their list for sure.
Well, space is tight, obviously, so I wouldn't go as far as overlooked, and there's more mana concerns once you add white mana, but I do think Brad's list is the place for the card to really shine. If you had to choose one of these 2 decks, the Bant list that Javier and Marcio played or this Simic list that Brad played, do you have one that you prefer right now?
I would play more like Brad's list, but I would not play Risen Reef, and I would try and get some Teferis into the deck. And maybe some white sideboard cards.
Okay. So Brad...
A mix.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're smushing the 2 together. Brad had 12 Accelerants, which I think is a really interesting approach. And it's one that, like... I'm not going to say it doesn't contemplate the existence of a Rat deck, because that's going too far. But it's one that a Rat deck is pretty happy to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you end up picking up a lot of those for free, and these Simic decks are very often incentivized to keep hands with low land counts because they have these accelerators, and then once you do figure out a way to maneuver around what they're doing and sweep their board, like they're just stuck on 2 or 3 lands and they can't recover.
Right. It's worth noting, until I played Brad, he was 6-0, absolutely crushed the Swiss. And, you know, so again, be wary of the narratives coming out of tournaments like this. It's easy to be very excited about the Esper Dance deck and say it looks like the best deck, but I would put just as much stock in what Brad did in that tournament, going 6-1 again against an incredibly difficult field. Says a lot about the quality of this deck. You see, it's very streamlined, mostly 4-ofs, has very clear plans, very powerful, proactive things to be doing. I don't know. This deck looks very nice to me, and I think it could be another great choice for week 1 standard. It's pretty nice that all these players are playing these day 0 tournaments, and there's so much information that someone preparing for like the SCG in Philly can really mine and try and figure out what to do when it comes to that tournament.
And this is over a week beforehand, right? Like you still now have the opportunity to play for a week on Arena with you know, your own schedule and everything. So yeah,
there's even another fandom tournament this weekend. There's one on Sunday. There's the Caster Cup on Sunday, which I'm also playing
because you're big time.
I don't know about that, but then there's next week's tournament too. So just a wealth of information before the set even releases. It's crazy.
Yeah. So Brad's list I like a lot. I like what you're saying also about the narrative of the tournament, where overall you went 6-2, right? Like 3-2 in the Swiss, 3-0 the top 8.
Yep.
Brad overall went 6-1.
Better record.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's worth noting. I think this deck is great, and I am curious to see if Brad wants to change anything up, or if he was at all dissatisfied with the archetype. I think our games were very close in the semifinals. Could have very easily gone the other way.
Maybe if his list was a little bit more prepared.
Maybe. I mean, like, he wasn't. I'm not going to put words in his mouth. I don't know if he was contemplating the Esper deck, but you assume most people weren't that into it. Although I don't know. We talked about how Andre is number 1 on the clout rankings presently. Him calling a deck the best deck in Standard should hold a lot of weight. I thought I would face mirrors, quite frankly, and I tried to prepare for them. So
no, yeah, you said that you thought they were going to be 4 in the tournament, and I was like, I don't know. I mean, I think someone else is going to play it, and you were literally the only person.
Just me, only idiot.
Well, who's got the chips, man?
I guess that's true.
Yeah, Brad's deck looks very good. I do like it a lot, but like only 2 disdainful strokes in the sideboard. Things like Agent of Treachery is obviously solid in other mid-range matchups, but not very good against your Esper deck. So I think it's safe to say that he was not really prepared for that sort of deck. And I agree that Andre has a lot of clout. I mean, it is easy to obtain clout when you are frequently right about the things that you say,
right,
and you just don't say things at random. You know, like he has a good track record and a big following. I do think that he has a lot of reach as far as Magic is concerned, but like, you know, Brad's got his own clout for a lot of different reasons.
Very
and
true.
I think it's pretty reasonable for him to just go with his gut and listen to himself and not just like fall into Andre's trap or whatever. So
of course.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that Brad probably just didn't listen to Andre, maybe didn't see his tweet, didn't put a lot of stock in it.
Well, we'll have more to say about Andre as we move through these top 8 lists.
Okay,
So.
fair enough. Yeah, Brad's list looks great. I would try and incorporate Teferi. Maybe it's not worth it. I mean, like Castle Gerry and Bryan is obviously very powerful, and then things get a little dicey there, especially when you have 8 X spells. Gerry and Bryan is nice.
Yeah, big Crasises coming out of this deck. Ready for the next deck?
Yeah, so now we have Simic Food, played by Caleb, presumably lost to Javier in top 4.
Correct. And I don't know what to make of that. I mean, I don't think there's a whole lot of takeaways from that matchup. I want to point out something interesting we haven't had a chance to talk about yet. Caleb's list, 4 copies of Once Upon a Time. Javier and Marcio played 1. Brad played 0 copies of Once Upon a Time. What do you make of that?
So Brad had a lot of redundancy in his list, though, where he had 12 mana creatures, 25 land, 8 fight creatures. You know, he's like probably reasonably set up to have lands, mana dork, fight creature. So you could potentially try and shave on some of those numbers, incorporate some Once Upon a Times, increase the consistency a little bit, but then that card gets a lot worse after sideboarding when you're bringing in a bunch of Veil of Summers, Aether Gust, Negates, stuff like that. Like, obviously, you can build your sideboard in such a way where you're leaning on the shifting Ceratops side of things. And maybe that's correct, maybe it's not. But my experience with Once Upon a Time has not been super favorable. But even in Caleb's deck, you see Gilded Goose, Once Upon a Time, and also Arboreal Grazer, a Paradise Druid. So people are leaning heavily into consistency, which I mostly agree with, especially when you have something that's high variance like Gilded Goose. Like games where you don't have a Goose or another Mana Accelerator on turn 1, and the games where you don't are vastly different. So
Sure.
I understand completely leaning into that. I think the other builds of Simic, the more mid-range ones, have gone a different direction just by playing a higher density of that sort of stuff.
I think that's an interesting approach. I don't know if I'm ready to give an opinion on Once Upon a Time in Standard. I think it's Busto in Modern, but that's a whole nother story. I'm sure we'll be doing some Modern content very soon.
Yeah.
I'm excited about unpacking all that. But the story here is, of course, Feasting Troll King, 4 copies in Caleb's deck. Presumably what this deck is built around, but like, not really, right? That's the secret here, is that this isn't really a Feasting Troll King deck. It's just using Feasting Troll King as a powerful threat, replacing some of the top end that some of these other decks have. But it's really a very similar core in Wicked Wolf, Hydroid Krasis, a bunch of ramp, and Okos and Nissas.
Yeah, I look at this. I mean, for Wicked Wolf, you don't wake up and you're just like, oh, I'm going to play for Wicked Wolf, right? Like, not only does it have potential downsides where if you're playing against like Creature Light or in kind of your case, like 0 creature decks, we don't really see like 4 copies of a card like this in decks a lot of the time. So there's also the aspect where it's like maybe they just have a bunch of like Spawn of Mayhems and Rotting Regisaurs, and you have to like really work to get Wolf to kill those things. So
Sure.
this card has a potential fail rate, and both Caleb and Brad were like, nah, we're playing 4. We are convinced that it is that good, and I think it is safe to just lump it in with like Goose and Oko as being part of that food package that is very strong in the Standard environment. And you went to Kaya's Wrath because creatures are a big deal. They went to Wicked Wolf. I think that that's a fine take also.
Yeah, like I said, Wicked Wolf probably more than any other single card really impressed me over the course of this tournament. I played against it many, many times. I often bemoaned my lack of D-Spark to answer Wicked Wolf.
Yeah.
Because I had stupid disenchants. This would be a problem for my deck. And I'm saying that, but I always managed it. Like, I always found a way.
I know.
You have Doom Foretold, you have Thought Erasure, you have Teferi. You can find ways around Wicked Wolf for sure. But, like, you mentioned my deck is one of the fail rates. And I'm saying it was one of the more problematic cards for me.
Fair enough.
So, like, does it really even have a fail state in that case? And I think the answer is mostly no. I think this card is just an absolute powerhouse. And if you're goosing and Okoing, this is the third prong in that collabo, I think. You're going to just see a ton of Wicked Wolves going forward. And, man, does that squeeze the red deck so hard.
Yeah.
This is such a beater.
When I started building decks in this format, it was like, okay, I want to play 2 Wolves because I recognize that the format is kind of moving in that direction, where there are a lot of creatures, and I'm happily sideboarding the other 2 copies. In creature light metagames overall, you might just play like 1 or whatever, but it is so good in those matchups that I just wanted the full 4. It's like I could play an Aether Gust, but no, Wolf is better. It's just better. And obviously you get to supplement that with Aether Gust and stuff like that are good in mirror matches, but Wolf is the thing that you start with. And I think that is very quickly becoming one of my favorite cards in the food package. Whereas before it was like, oh, Feasting Troll King. Like, that's the big payoff, right? And I don't believe that anymore. Especially in a deck like Caleb's, where he's not doing anything crazy. He doesn't have, like,
Don't see Witch's Oven. That's the one I'm looking for.
Yeah, here. No Oven, no Tamio to mill into it, no Emery, no, like, Tomebound Lich Splash, no Merchant of the Veil. All this nonsense that we've seen people try and do to try and turbo this card into play. Caleb's casting it, and I think that that's fine, but it's really not that big of a payoff.
Mostly agree with you. And that's not me dismissing this card in kind. I think there's still a chance that Feasting Troll King can become one of the pillars of present standard. And, I mean, maybe it's even in this deck. Again, Caleb with a very solid record here. Maybe we're missing something. Something here is solved. But I think this archetype still has some more evolving to do. If you're not going hard on the Feasting Troll King package, I would rather see a different top end for the most part.
Well, I'm looking at this deck with like Krasis, Troll King, even Wicked Wolf, and Nissa producing a lot of mana. Like, where are the Great Henges?
That's a good question. And that card was extremely, extremely impressive against me when it was in play. I think it's just a slam dunk great card. We will see some copies as we move through the top 8.
Good.
But all these folks choosing to omit the Great Henge for the time being.
Oh, fair enough. I mean, I like the food synergies. I've been working on this archetype a lot, and it's also just been one of the most frustrating things for me because it's so difficult to figure out.
It is tough.
There are so many different like little packages that you can merge and splice together. Like Emery Vantress Gargoyle is one. Splashing a color Witch's Oven with Cauldron Familiar is very good, and that's currently kind of what I'm doing now. And then you get to play like Rotting Regisaur and the Great Henge. Great Henge, Oven, Witches or Cauldron Familiar works really well together. There's just so many little things, and then there's Caleb's take, which is just like, I'm just going to play these because they're good cards and I'll play a normal deck. I mean, Arboreal Grazer is kind of not normal, but other than that, it's what you would expect. It's Simic Rares.
Arboreal Grazer with 25 lands, just on the cusp of acceptable.
Right.
I still have some reservations, though. I would be much more comfortable if there were 26 lands here. I would even say, like, if you believe one-drop Accelerant is that important, I would rather see 26 lands and 3 Arboreal Grazers. I think that's just, like, a more proactive way to go about this.
At least make sure it hits.
Yeah.
You know? But I think there's added value to...
There's also 4 Once Upon a Time, though. We should mention that. Like, that alters your land count.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that makes sense. So it is... I would say that this is like he has 26, if not 27 land.
Okay. Okay, I rescind my point.
If you want to lock in on always hitting a land with Once Upon a Time when you have a Grazer, just to make sure that you're able to curve out. I mean, obviously it's game dependent, but yeah, I think the interesting thing about Grazer is that it gives Oko a little bit more utility where you can just turn it into a 3/3 and start hitting them, or like even defend the Oko. You know?
Good point.
And it gives you another way to like turn to it. Like, what if you Grazer into Oko on 2 and then you make a 3/3, you have this blocker, your Oko is going to live forever.
Yeah. No, that's a cool synergy. Maybe I was being a little too negative on Caleb's deck. I do think there are cool stuff. There's cool things going on here. I'm not 100% sold on Feasting Troll King, but this Once Upon a Time Arboreal Grazer way of cheating a second 1-mana accelerant when almost nobody else has access to it. Pretty cool thing to do. And also you just have like more virtual gooses once you play Once Upon a Time.
Yep.
So you just got to make sure you're getting paid in the late game on those Once Upon a Time. The payoff here is just like recurring your Feasting Troll Kings.
Yeah, pretty much.
Maybe that's good.
Yeah, this deck is really interesting. It's weird for me because I've been struggling to build these archetypes, and by that I mean I've built 30 of them.
Right.
And come to a place where I'm actually happy. And Caleb just took the Occam's Razor route. It's just like, yeah, I'll just play all
the good cards.
Play all the good cards. What the hell?
There's a lot of value. We talked a lot on our podcast this week about things like holes in our game, things we don't do as deck builders. One of the things I don't do a good job of is just taking the best cards and mushing them together. The other thing I do a poor job of is doing the small updates to existing archetypes. And I would kind of classify Javier's deck as a small update to the already existing, like small and honestly obvious update to the existing archetype.
For sure.
And that's not to disqualify his deck building whatsoever. Like that's something that I lack, something I wish I did a better job of, because you see how powerful of a deck Javier and Marcio ended up with.
Yeah, and I can do that. It's just kind of boring.
It's a little boring. Yeah.
Like, new set came out, plus rotation. We have, like, all these awesome cards in the set, and they're just like, well, I mean, Hydra Crisis is still good. I'm just going to play this. And
Correct.
It's like, yeah, good.
Yeah, can't argue with that.
You did it. So, yeah, another interesting take from Caleb. Worth noting that not a lot of people are playing similar decks to this. Like, a lot of people are trying to go all in on Troll King, and he's just casting it.
Yeah, good stuff. Next deck.
Normal deck. Very normal deck.
Look, like when you see this all together, you're like, oh, this actually makes a lot of sense. And again, I think this deck is probably very, very good. I really like what PV did here. I'm hoping we get to see a little bit more of it. And an appearance of Curious Pair in this deck as well. Were you expecting to see that one?
So I like that card, but I recognize that it's most likely underpowered and not really solving the problems that you need it to. So like, I was like, oh, this would be like maybe a cool card against mono red, right? Like you make a 1/3, block their 2/1s, you have a food for later, and then they just play Experimental Frenzy and go over the top of you. And it's like, well, yeah, I'm sideboarding against the wrong stuff, obviously. But this deck happens to care about food, and Curious Pair is not a wolf. I thought it was a wolf.
Not a wolf, sorry.
Okay, yeah, I have no idea why that card's in this deck then.
Well, I mean, I guess it's just a concession that you need some more food. You need possibly early blockers to survive, and then you'll get, like, think about playing against mono red. Just having this 1/3 and then eventually going Wicked Wolf into Tulsimir means you're fine. And this seems like a concession to a more aggro focused format, like maybe Knights this card might be meaningful against. I could see that as well.
Sure. I mean, they have a lot of ways to buff and get around this. I honestly thought it was a wolf, and I was like, okay, that's cute. But it being a human, yeah, I just go back to my original thoughts where I'm like, I like this card. It is cool, but I don't think it's good enough. And especially with the 4 Once Upon a Times, I think Paulo would probably benefit from exploring what Caleb did and playing the 4 Grazers.
Seems pretty good to me. Yeah, that's something we're going to have to keep our eye on going forward if other people pick that up. Because this is certainly a deck that wants to ramp, right? You see 8 4-drops, 4 Night Pack Ambusher, and 4 Wicked Wolf. And then you got a top end of 3 Tulsimir and 3 Garrick Cursed Huntsman, all the wolves coming to the party. This has to be an absolute nightmare for aggressive decks, and I feel like I'm just saying that about every single one of these decks.
Yep. 2 copies of Great Henge at the top end too, which is worth noting because I think those are the first copies we're seeing of that card
thus far. Yep.
So I've played against this deck a few times on Arena, and it was easier certainly knowing what was in their deck. But I think if you go to an open or a PTQ or something like that, and as long as you're not doing anything too fancy, like maybe as soon as you do it, like Curious Pair stuff or whatever, the jig is up, but, or like you Once Upon a Time into a Tulsimir or something.
Right.
But if you just play like normal Bant cards, don't play a Godless Shrine, don't fetch a Swamp, you can get people with Night Pack Ambusher, like you would not necessarily expect it out of a deck that has just a lot of sorcery speed things. So I think you have a lot of value there. It's kind of weird that Paulo also just did well in this tournament when it is open deck lists and people knew everything that was coming. But I also I know that Nightpack Ambusher is mostly just an anthem for this deck, and is just a solid card. But some of the versions I played against had Vivian Champion of the Wilds. And that, with Nightpack Ambusher, and especially in a deck like this, you have so many creatures. Vivian has a lot of high-impact hits. It made things more difficult because if they pass with 4 open mana, they don't necessarily just have Nightpack Ambusher. It could be any number of things. Maybe they don't have Nightpack Ambusher, you know? So that's something that I would explore, maybe not main deck, but certainly as a sideboard option. And, I mean, overall, like, Paulo's deck is cool. I think that he is the mid-range deck that is a little bit smaller than the other mid-range decks, which I don't really like.
Yeah, and we talk about that problem a lot. In comparison to something like Hydroid Krasis getting really huge, this deck can seem a little bit quaint. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
This is certainly more ready to prey on the lower end of things, really beat up all the aggressive decks. I mean, what do you think about the role of Garruk, Cursed Huntsman in mid-range matchups?
I'd rather cast Krasis X equals 4 and then have the variability of casting Krasis X equals 10. I would rather have Nissa.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've seen this card in play a couple times. It has not really impressed me. Some people continue putting it in their decks. Some people have been vocal about how much they like it. I have yet to be sold. I don't know how you feel. Obviously, it fits the theme, but like, you don't necessarily need to have this wolf theme. You also don't need to go that hard on it. So,
yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, abstractly, I do think Nissa is a more powerful card, and you do see 2 copies over in Paulo's sideboard. But without the payoff of Hydroid Krasis, it's like, well, I'm not really finding a mana sink for my Nissas here.
It's a 3/3 making machine at that point, which is still good. But
you see how one begets the other. Like, you need some kind of sticky threat like that, and Garruk certainly has tons of synergies to lean on. The more I just think about this deck, the more I'm like, how do you ever lose against an aggressive deck?
You can't. But I think that normal Bant is stronger in the pseudo mirror and also fairly reasonable against aggro. So I don't really know what we're doing here except for playing sweet cards out of our trade binder.
I do love these sweet cards. Next deck, Marcio's. We talked about this, as we said, exactly Javier's list card for card. So we'll move on to Andre Strosky's list. I beat Andre in the round of 8. Extremely, extremely close matchup. But Andre was undone by not playing the deck he declared the best deck in Standard.
Yeah, what a dick move to use all your clout to throw people off the scent.
Well, he came into my stream afterwards, after our match, and said he just wasn't comfortable enough with the deck yet.
That actually makes sense to me.
Yeah, and then I asked about this deck, because I think this deck looks very sweet. It has a lot of the most powerful cards in Throne of Eldraine. You see 4 copies of Bone Crusher Giant, 4 copies of Murderous Rider. That synergy is awesome. I love it. I love how much value you're getting out of your good, totally reasonable proactive threats. 3 copies of Rankle. Rankle, a card you know I'm super high on and think still has a lot to say about this format.
I like it too. It's also a rogue for Robber of the Rich.
100%. Yep.
Rotting Regisaur with Robber of the Rich is kind of nice because it keeps the count in your hand low.
Sure.
So also some synergies going on in this deck. But yeah, like pound for pound on the curve. I mean, this is basically what Mono Red was last season, where just
home run after home run.
Yeah, even like E2 Lava Runner on 1, and it's like, oh, I have like this 1/1 to block, but it's gonna be a 2/2, and then they have Steamkin into Chain Whirler into Frenzy, and now it's this deck where they're just like everything is a must kill threat.
Yeah, and it looks really exciting until
you get to the part where it's like, holy crap, that's a lot of basic land. How do I ever cast my spells? How do I play turn 1 black 1-drop, turn 2 red-black 2-drop into Spawn of Mayhem? You have so many double black cards, and then also a lot of just all the red cards you're splashing, I guess, are basically 2 mana. So you need double black very early, you need red early, and you're just doing it off of 4 Blood Crypts and a Dream.
This mana base asks so much of you. You will mulligan a lot because of it. You will just not be able to play spells a lot because of it. And I understand the sentiment that you can't play Fabled Passage in an aggressive deck because you can't afford a tapped land. Well, I have bad news for you. You can't play this deck then. It's not a viable archetype in the absence of a better mana base than this. And I think like Gruul has the same problem. Like aggressive Gruul decks, you need to find a way that you can loop Fabled Passage into your plans, and I don't think you can convince me that this is just better than taking the hit from Fabled Passage. I think you're that priced in to having reliable access to your mana, but certainly the deck downgrades at that point, and it's like, I don't know. I don't know if this is something you can realistically do in this format, given how good the Bant decks look right now, how streamlined they are, how quickly they're accelerating. If you fall behind against the Bant deck and they start doing wolf-based things to you, you will not have a very good time.
Yeah, or even just, you missed a land drop or are missing a color, you didn't get to play something on turn 3, play Teferi, bounce one of your things, like, you lose. You fall so far behind, you lose. So what I would recommend doing if you are like Knight of the Ebon Legion, Gutter Bones, those cards are great. Mm-hmm. You have Murderous Rider, Rotting Regisaur, Spawn of Mayhem, Rankle.
Nice.
Great. Play mono black. Take the hit on your 2-drops. You lose a little bit of staying power by losing Bonecrusher Giant and Robber of the Rich and stuff. But like Order of Midnight, that card's fine. Stone Coil Serpent, that card is passable. And then the other 2-drop I was playing was Blacklands Paragon, which is not good, but you need something in the 2-mana slot. And for the most part, you just lean on your bigger stuff anyway. It doesn't matter. Like, play Literal Grizzly Bear, and you'll have, like, basically the same results, if not better, because you'll actually be able to cast your spells.
Right.
And if you decide you need something like Experimental Frenzy, I mean, you can kind of find similar cards in black, but, like, you can play Blood Crypts and, like, 3 Fabled Passages and a Mountain, or, like, you can even free roll a couple colorless lands in mono black. And those will just be mountains.
I honestly believe it's so early in the format to say this, and I could be made to look like an idiot almost instantly. Honestly, there were no Knights decks in this tournament. Maybe Knights is the answer that we're looking for. I said I was pretty impressed by Ari Lax's 3-color Knight build with more 1-drops and 2-drops. That seemed pretty good to me. But as it stands right now, I am concerned about aggro in this format. I think it's going to have a very hard time making inroads. I think more hybridized approaches. I have a mono black deck that is based around Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven and still has Rankle. You can play Rotting Regisaur in it if you want. You can make things a little bit more aggressive. And I think having that kind of reach, being able to ignore battlefields a little bit, might be a really big deal for these decks. I like the flying threats a lot, quite frankly. I think
Order of Midnight is great.
Yeah, I think Spawn of Mayhem, Order of Midnight, Rankle, like if you put all those cards together in your mono black aggro deck, that's starting to sound pretty appealing. Gutter Bones, obviously going to be there for your Rankle rebuys. And then just like...
That never happens. That's so just like slow and dirtily.
Oh, you haven't lived my life. I've been doing that nonstop.
So if you're playing the Oven and the Familiar, Ayara, Priest of Forgotten God, stuff like that, obviously your games are going to go on later.
Right.
You know, you're more set up to play a long game, so I could see that happening. But from playing a little bit of Rakdos and a decent amount of mono black, that's never come out.
Rankle just kills you on the first attack, basically.
Maybe, or it's like you don't need to rebuy the Gutter Bones. Basically, I feel like if you're spending mana doing that, you're probably losing.
Okay.
Well, yeah, obviously a lot of powerful cards. This is all rares, effectively, straight out of your trade binder. They're all great. They look better now in this format after rotation than they ever have. Like Rotting Regisaur, Spawn of Mayhem. Someone I think just tweeted Spawn is up to like $20 or whatever. So
I get it.
Missed the boat on that. But like, yeah, these cards when they got previewed, it was like, oh man, they're so big, but just didn't line up against things in the last format, and they're a lot better now.
Agreed. They all have improved. We just got to find the correct way to stick them together. Let's move on to our final deck here from the Fandom Legends top 8.
Another horrible deck name. I have no idea what the hell this is.
Let's just call it Golgari Midrange.
Deal.
Midrange is not particularly elegant, it turns out. It's Golgari Midrange with the Great Henge. And I like a lot of what's happening here. Huey squeaked into the top 8, beating Shahar, who played the exact same list.
Yep.
So decent performance for the archetype. Huey lost in the top 8. I beat Shahar in the Swiss. I was impressed by a lot of what the deck had going on. The Growth Chamber Guardian Great Henge synergy, that's a cute one. I really
It is
liked
nice.
And you and I talked on the podcast a couple weeks ago about the possibility of combining Rotting Regisaur with the Great Henge. Again, the power level in this deck. Like, look how powerful these cards are.
Yeah, this is the Golgari equivalent of the Rakdos deck that we talked about, except instead of Gutter Bones, because that card is kind of mopey, Huey just played Temple of Malady as effectively as 1-drop, which I think is completely fine. Rakdos doesn't have that option.
Correct.
Otherwise, we would probably do it. I mean, you could play Fabled Passage, but like obviously not as strong as a Temple. So, yeah, just busted, insane creatures with a bunch of words all up the chain. Great Henge to keep pushing through those late game scenarios, but realistically, I would expect games to just be virtually over on like turn 5 or 6 with this deck a lot of the time based on the power level. But if your opponent is, doing other mid-rangey things, like, yeah, you need a way to kind of keep going, and Great Henge provides that.
Yeah, Shahar and I played quite long games. Great Henge, certainly a vital part of them. Here we're looking at 4 Once Upon a Time. I like it here.
Just fill out your curve.
Yeah, never miss a creature, basically. Always have your creature ready. Lot to like about this deck. Lot to like about the power level. Love the 4 Questing Beast. Thinking about how this lines up against the Bant decks that we saw absolutely take over this tournament.
Probably get smashed.
Yeah, Bant decks come out of the gate faster, right? They have more accelerants.
Their mana's better. Granted, Once Upon a Time fixes this a little bit, but this deck has a lot of CC stuff in both sides, like Spawn, Murderous Rider, Questing Beast. Mm-hmm. You have some fixes for that, obviously. Like there's also Fabled Passage on top of the temples. You have Paradise Druid. You have Once Upon a Time, but it's still going to cause some awkwardness every once in a while. And yeah, just things like tempo tools, like Oko, Teferi, eventually kind of stabilizing with Hydroid Krasis, having all the mana acceleration. I think those things are just huge.
You would think 4 Murderous Rider, 4 Questing Beasts is enough to keep these Planeswalkers under check. I'm not really sure it is, though. I mean, like, there's still a problem in a lot of situations, and it's the snowball problem. Planeswalkers are very snowbally. If you get on the battlefield early with Anissa and start pushing it, some of this stuff doesn't matter as much, and you can find blocks for that Questing Beast, and you don't mind Murderous Rider taking out Nissa after you've made a bunch of tokens and are pressuring your opponent's life total. So I want this deck to be good, and I think it's at least a good start on the Golgari mid-range archetype. I love a lot of the synergies here. I just need to think more about how this will interact with the Bant decks going forward and see if it needs to make some adjustments, when I think I'm just giving that like tier 1 status. I think the Bant decks get tier 1
hands down
for week 1. As far as what else is occupying that, I'm putting Dance in like 1.5 right now. I think it has to be accounted for, but I think people will ultimately find successful ways to account for that deck going forward. Then the onus is back on Dance to be able to adapt.
Right.
Maybe that happens. Maybe it doesn't. We'll see.
I mean, Esper colors are very agile. You have a lot of good sideboard options, and all it takes really is just like one good sideboard juke.
Right.
You figure out that right card. Again, secret spoiler coming up on a future deck tech. Brian, you might have the card. I don't know. But we'll see. We'll see how everything plays out. In regards to this deck against Bant specifically, I feel like Bant is just better at double spelling. And they're going to do things like, Nissa either make a 3/3 or Nissa make a 3/3 and play another spell. And then your turn is going to be like Murderous Rider, tap land. And that's the type of stuff where you really fall behind. So these decks that are built like the old Jund Monsters decks, I mostly want to stay away.
Okay. Don't sleep on Nissa mana advantage, really. That's my takeaway here.
Yeah, I think
just huge.
We all kind of forgot about Nissa just because, like, oh, look at these fancy new cards, right?
Always want to play with the new toys.
Nah, she's still the nuts. She's still broke.
Okay, those are our top 8 archetypes. I mean, any closing takeaways from this tournament? I guess we already set up our tier list. Anything else? Yeah,
kind of. I mean, maybe we'll release like an official one after a few more days of playing, stuff like that. But I mean, Huey's record combined with Shahar's overall was 5-5 or 4-5, not counting the mirror match.
No, they would have had, if you don't count the mirror match, yes, 4-5.
So overall, not that great. But again, like a bunch of powerful cards, can win some tournaments, but like, solidly tier 2. I think that's about it. I mean, I'm very interested in Bant. I'm a little interested in Esper. Definitely interested in still working on food, but yeah, Oko Goose. It's the jam.
You got anything still in the 2 brew pile that you think could make some inroads? Fires of Invention.
Fires of Invention is
that's where I'm focused right now. Still think that card has a ton of potential.
I've also played against some proliferate like affinity decks that have looked pretty strong, actually.
Okay, interesting. I built one early, and I was just kind of like, this can't be good. Like, is it actually good? Did it have Evolution Sage?
The one I played against did not, and then someone tweeted me a list that looked similar to the one I played against, and it may have actually been the person I played against.
Okay.
But it was Bant, actually, with Oko and Teferi.
Oh. Okay, that goes well with counters, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, they just did the fish thing against me and just beat me up real bad. Had like a Miser's manifold key that they used with Steel Overseer.
Right.
Like one or two corridor monitors that they also combined with Steel Overseer.
Okay, we're getting up to some shenanigans now.
Yeah, and then obviously you have a lot of good targets for Oko because you make like, this 0 mana thing with 4+1/+1 counters on it, give it +3/+3 with Oko, just start beating face, and then had 2 copies of Dance of the Mance at the top end too. So yeah, a lot of
speaking my language.
Yeah, a lot of crazy stuff. I'm really interested in Evolution Sage and just like staying on the straight and narrow, going the beatdown path, stuff like that. But there are a lot of avenues to take that, and I think that those decks, when their engine comes together, it ends up looking like this sort of monsters deck, except your cards all cost like 1 mana less.
Right.
So potentially broken sort of thing that could exist, but just maybe a little too inconsistent.
I'm looking forward to exploring that. If you are disheartened by what you've seen of this metagame thus far, don't be. It's so, I mean, we're on day 2 of the format right now, and I see people like sitting out this standard format. What are you talking about? Why do you even play Magic if you feel that way right now? It's absolutely crazy to me.
We got to start a new YouTube series where it's just Bryan ranting about random things.
It's just absolutely bonkers. The metagame will continue to change. Interesting set. I'm cool with it. Who knows where it settles, but enjoying things right now.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, people can complain, they can leave, they can not play Magic. I'll be over here having fun building decks and playing against people.
Right.
And, I don't know why you would not want that in your life, but hey, to each their own.
Agreed.
Yeah, that's it for us. Hope y'all enjoyed this. Anytime a random tournament happens that we think that there's a lot to talk about, maybe we do something like this. Maybe we try and, cut the length down a little bit. We're talkers. We're both talkers.
We try every time. We never do it.
We keep going. But, if y'all enjoy this, definitely like, subscribe, comment, let us know how you felt, because ultimately, like, a lot of people's feedback is going to determine what direction the channel takes into the future.
Absolutely.
So let us know what you like, what you don't like, what helps, all that good stuff. And that's game.
That's game.